Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today, and thanks for attending today's webinar, Complying with General Data Protection Regulation on Microsoft SQL-based technologies. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items that I'd like to address. If you take a look on the left-hand side of your webinar console, you should see a Q&A box. We have a few technical experts here who would be happy to answer any questions you have throughout the duration of this presentation. If you now take a look on the right-hand side of your console, we have provided a list of resources. These are resources that are found throughout this PowerPoint presentation, and you can click on them and download them at your leisure. Below that, you should see a survey box. We would really appreciate any feedback you have on the content of this presentation, and we'd be very interested to learn what you would like to learn more about in the future. You will be sent a recording of this presentation within 48 hours at the exact email address you registered with. So with that, I would like to introduce today's speakers, Federico Rezende and Ronit Reger.
Thank you so much, Nick. Hello, this is Federico Rezende. I am the Data State Modernization Lead here in Microsoft Corp, and I am accompanied by Ronit Reger, our Senior Program Manager, who will be demoing some of the hero features and services of our platform. And the objective of this webinar today is to talk to you about how to take the GDPR journey, leveraging Microsoft SQL-based technologies, leveraging the innovations that we bring with SQL Server 2016 and 17, Azure SQL Database, and Azure SQL Data Warehouse. But independently of this new regulation, this new privacy law that is landing in Europe, why is data privacy, data protection so important for our businesses? We know that attacks are becoming more and more sophisticated. According to a research from Verizon last year called Data Breach Investigations Report, around 70% of the attacks are coming from outside of our companies, but still 25% coming from inside our enterprises. And the attacks are finding new ways to enter our platforms, our environments, and attack the most important or one of the most important assets of our businesses, data. So this new regulation that is landing in Europe right now is a regulation that expands EU residents and citizens' rights so they can access, export, edit, and delete their personal data. So this brings a demand for us to increase our privacy policies and, of course, our security measures, because we need to be able to identify where sensitive data is stored, understand how it's being accessed and used, protect it so you don't lose the volume of data that you have, the volume of sensitive data that you have stored in your company, and of course report it back to your customers, to your employees, to your partners that live or that are citizens of the EU. And this is a privacy law that brings a lot of challenges for companies across the globe that do businesses with EU citizens and residents, because the real question is, are we really prepared to do all those things? To identify where this data is, to understand how it's been used? Do we have the right technology to protect it and report back to the citizens? For companies that don't comply with GDPR, there are fines tied to it that can come up to 20 million euros, or 4% of annual global turnover, whichever is greater. So there is a financial penalty, but the real penalty can be your reputation, our reputation. Because if sensitive data gets leaked and it is used in a harmful way, it can damage our brands. And that is why Microsoft is adopting GDPR as a global policy, we are implementing these measures to allow our own customers to have access, edit, and delete their personal data. But with regard to the privacy law, this is impacting companies that do business with EU residents and citizens, and there is an important milestone now. The first enforcement is now on May 25th. But it's important to understand that this is a multi-year program, and it's a program that will demand assessing your infrastructure, because it's not only related necessarily with your data platform. You will need the support, if you don't have that yet, of specialized services, either from Microsoft or from a partner of ours, because the important thing here is, of course, understand how the regulation will affect your business, but be able to take this journey with consulting services that allow you to have a simplification of the steps that you need to take with the right technology that will also allow you to simplify that journey, uncovering risks to take action fast with the agility that the market demands. Now, when we look at GDPR, when we look at this new privacy law, as I mentioned, the important thing is to look at this as a comprehensive multi-year program that does have financial impacts tied to the law, but of course may have key relevant reputation challenges. And understanding the framework of the new regulation is key, but also thinking of your infrastructure today. Are you ready to respond to your customers, to your employees, to your partners, to all EU residents that you have a relationship with, allowing them to have this experience to assess their sensitive data, their sensitive personal data, to edit, to delete it, to export it. So more and more, of course, data is, so in this exercise, data is at the core, so super important to understand your data strategy. Do you have a data platform that is modern enough to allow you to do data discovery, have a governance around the entire process, but protect the sensitive data and be able to report back? Of course, not only looking at your data state, but also looking at how the applications will be impacted. In many cases, this will not only be a matter of rehosting the application. You will need to rebuild this application, and cloud comes as one of the key solutions to help you implement this kind of strategy, as more and more our services are becoming more intelligent with features that are built in and then that can help you even eliminate the burden of managing this platform, so you can have a continuous monitoring even of your environment. And these are some of the things that we're going to be showing you in the demos further on in the presentation. So the message here is that this is really a holistic strategy that companies need to take, looking at the entire life cycle of sensitive data and looking at the current infrastructure to see the gaps and the areas of opportunity to improve. We are ready to support you throughout the way. With our consulting services and our partners, we are ready to help you with the right technology, take the steps that you need to have an enhanced data protection policy in your company. Being able to discover where this sensitive data is stored, and of course, again, be able to know how it's been used and accessed, protected, and then report back, because the new regulation does demand that we report back whatever breach or whatever vulnerability. Now, our portfolio, and I said in the beginning that our portfolio has some great innovations that can help you with these steps, and some of them are brand new, available on our cloud and coming pretty soon to our on-premises solutions. Let's talk a little bit about each step that I just mentioned to help you identify where this data is, see if it is protected enough, have a governance process around it, and of course report it back. When we talk about doing the discovery exercise to identify where sensitive data is stored, we have a number of technologies from the data platform portfolio of solutions that can help you with this exercise. To inventory personal data in database systems, we have the new data discovery and classification. This is one of the services that Ronit will show you how it works, and it's amazing. I'm going to be talking to you about it in the next slide. But we also have the new vulnerability assessment that Ronit is also going to demo, and that can help you have this kind of a security dashboard to monitor the vulnerabilities in your environment. But starting from the very beginning, doing the exercise to identify where sensitive data is stored, the new data discovery and classification really scans the database to identify sensitive data and help you label it, help you tag it, so you can classify it according to your standards, your policies. Very easy to use. You see that it's very dynamic in the demo. Now, if we're talking about the governance around your data state, understanding who has access to sensitive data, how it's being used, we also have from our portfolio a number of technologies and services that can help you with different steps of the way. Managing authentication and authorization mechanisms, of course, as you may already know, we have Azure Active Directory, authentication, and we also have role-based security Windows authentication. Now, to properly configure database firewalls, Azure SQL Firewall, and to limit the access to the applications according to authorization principles, who access what, dynamic data masking, row-level security, which are some of the hero services and features that we bring with our Microsoft SQL-based technologies. Row-level security brings you fine-grained access control over specific rows in a database, so you can really prevent unauthorized access. And this allows you to provide better support services, preventing your representative from getting access to customers' sensitive data, or your employees' sensitive data, or even your partner's sensitive data, these people that are residing or that are citizens of the EU, and that you have to now implement these measurements. Data masking, which is a solution that some of the companies that we see in the market offer as a separate product. In our case, this is built into the platform, and it allows you to really mask the data, so those that are working with it, manipulating that data, don't have access to the real information. In the graph on the right side, you see an example of a credit card. I think this is one of the easiest examples to give. Those people that have to work and manipulate that mass of data and cannot really have access to personal credit card numbers. So what the solution does is really mask these numbers so they don't see the real numbers of the credit card, the real data, but can continue to work with it without necessarily having access to that personal and sensitive data. Again, this is all built in the platform. You don't pay anything additional to have access to these technologies. Now, when we're talking about protecting your data state and personal sensitive data, there's a number of different technologies that can allow you to do that. Technologies that can allow you to encrypt your data at rest and in motion. Technologies that will allow you to audit database activities and identify threats. Technologies that can also allow you to ensure business continuity, so you don't have any impact in your operations. Let's talk a little bit about Always Encrypted. Always Encrypted is one of the key features that we bring with the platform. And this allows you to encrypt data in motion. The key stays with the customer. So you can leverage column encryption keys and column master keys to protect the data. Again, you can encrypt the data at rest and while you're transacting. And the SQL threat detection allows you to discover and identify anomalous activity. So you receive alerts upon suspicious database activities and vulnerabilities to take action. And what's beautiful about these services is that as they're becoming available first on our cloud, they're part of our intelligent solutions, and they even recommend remediation options. In many cases, they even bring the recommended tools. So you don't really have to be an expert, a technician, to understand necessarily what steps you need to take. When we're talking about reporting, because if we look at the demands from this regulation, the regulation demands first that we identify where this data is stored, but that we also understand how it's being used and accessed, that it's protected so it doesn't leak, but also you have to report back to your customers, to your partners, to your employees. And to report back breaches or vulnerabilities in the environment, we have technologies like auditing and temporal tables, and also have the new vulnerability assessment. The new vulnerability assessment is one of the key innovations that we're bringing to the portfolio. But let me talk a little bit before about the SQL Server audit that allows you to really report on the database activities and analyze trends so you can continuously track and log user-defined database level audits with the help of predefined templates. Again, technology allowing you to implement these policies in a easier way, no? But the vulnerability assessment that I so wanted to talk about is brand new, and this is a service, this is an innovation that only Microsoft has. So this is really kind of your security dashboard, because it scans issues and propose remediations with tools that sometimes will demand you to do some clicks and take some measurements, but not necessarily having to be to have that deep technical knowledge. We'd love to show you how all of this works. So I'm going to pass the mic to Ronit Redger, our Senior Program Manager, who will be sharing her screen and showing us how this works and how this can help us have identified where this sensitive data is and be able to classify it, and also have this constant monitoring over the potential vulnerabilities of the environment. Ronit, you have the mic.
Thank you, Federico. So I'm going to share my screen here with you so that you can see demos of these great features in action. Let's just make sure that you guys can see it. Okay. So Federico shared with you basically the strategy that we're working with customers on for meeting GDPR compliance, for starting to work on basically technologies, implementing technologies that can help meet the various principles of GDPR with the different phases of discovering where your sensitive data is, of managing the way your technical environment basically is being managed and your sensitive data is being managed, with the methods of protection for actually locking down and protecting your sensitive data and GDPR qualifying personal data, and also with the elements of reporting on what you're doing, whether it's reporting back to customers or reporting to the actual authorities to ensure that you're compliant. And in SQL, we've actually been thinking about where we can innovate to help customers along the path of basically those elements to start addressing GDPR issues. And so as Federico talked about, one of the major innovations that we've been making is this new vulnerability assessment service. So basically this assessment gives you sort of a central way to manage the security on your database system. As Federico mentioned, this is kind of a central dashboard that shows you what your security state is and what kind of things you can do to improve it, and ultimately results in a report that you can then share and use to basically show what your current security stature is. So walking through the screen, showing you the report we have here, basically what I'm seeing right now, we're now seeing a screenshot of the Azure portal. This is where I manage all of my Azure resources, and specifically I'm looking at my database here. And I've clicked on Vulnerability Assessment, which is a new feature that we have here appearing in the portal. And once I do that, then I see this report on my database showing me, again, kind of a breakdown of what the current status is in terms of things that we've been checking, and kind of a breakdown of the risk of the issues that we've found. Those are basically the failing checks that are things that, from a security standpoint, could be improved. And then immediately below, we basically show a broken down list of those failing issues. So this is basically your list of action items. These are the things that we recommend you do in order to lock down the security of your database better and basically reach a state where you're protecting your data and your database system better. So at this point, I'd like to walk you through what the actual action is at this point. We can actually now start to go through these action items of failed tests and start resolving them. So we actually can click through here. We'll click through the first top issue that was found. By the way, you'll notice that these are sorted according to risk level. So I'm seeing my high-risk items first, followed by medium and low. And so if I kind of go through the list starting with the high-risk items, I can click through here, and then I'll actually get some details about this particular issue that we found that we recommend you doing in order to improve your security. And we'll give you a description here explaining exactly what this vulnerability is. So in this case, we're basically seeing that you have some database users that have very high permissions in the database, and the recommendation is to minimize those permissions. This is basically a check that's helping you meet the sort of principle of least privilege and minimize the privileges of users on the database. So we describe, for every such check, we describe what it's checking. We describe the security impact and why this is important to improve the security on your database. And we even provide the actual query that we're running. So you have full transparency. You know exactly what we're running on your database and how we're checking that. And then we provide the results. So in this case, we ran this query on the database to check for these users that have these high impact permissions. And the result that we're seeing is that these two users are members of this particularly high impact database role. And what we're recommending that you do, and this is where the remediation comes in, is that you actually remove any members who don't really need to have access to that role. So in that way, you're minimizing the set of permissions on your database only to the permissions that are absolutely required. And not only do we explain what you need to do to remediate, but we actually give you a T-SQL script. So based on the results that you had, this is customized for your environment. We're saying if you run this script for these particular users that we found, then you can remediate the issue and remove these users if they do not need to have access to this role. And I can actually click here within the Azure portal, and this is one of the nice things in Azure, that everything is sort of right there, and I can just click through and actually run this directly on my database. So this is my query editor in the Azure portal, and if I log in here to my database, then the remediation script for this issue will actually come up, and all I'll need to do is just kind of run it directly here. So hopefully you've seen this come up already here now, and it's in front of my screen, and if I just click run, then I basically remove these users from these roles, and I have now improved security of my database by just a bit. I'm actually not going to run this. I'd like to show you another element of this vulnerability assessment that's important for customers, and that is basically looking at this. This is giving me a certain snapshot of the configuration in my environment. Now, if these are excessive permissions, then that means I want to remove them. But maybe in my environment, they're actually not excessive. perhaps these are actually the members that should be in these roles. These are my high privilege users. And if so, then I can actually approve this result as my baseline. And what that means is that this is the acceptable value for my environment. So these are the acceptable users that are members of this role in my environment. And from now on, whenever I run a vulnerability assessment on my database, then this will actually be the expected result. So if I click yes, that means, again, the next time I run an assessment, then this will be what's expected. And the vulnerability assessment will only notify me about any deviations from this state. And that way I can detect kind of drift and deviations of my security state. So we ran through one example. Let's continue and see a couple more examples of what types of things we're looking for to help you improve security. The next issue talks about server-level firewall rules. So again, this is also one of the major security concerns on your Azure SQL database, is having the firewall configured properly so that you don't have open access to any applications or basically IP addresses that you don't want to have access. And so we explain that in the description. We describe what the impact is, that if you do have superfluous entries in the firewall configuration, then that means that unauthorized sources could connect to your database. And again, we show you how we check it, and we give you the full set of results. Here is the current configuration of your firewall. And what this particular check recommends doing is evaluate all of these firewall rules that you have. Make sure you baseline the appropriate setting for your environment and remove any of those that are not necessary, that are superfluous, basically. And here again, we give you information on exactly how to resolve this. And you even have a link here that you can just click within the Azure portal itself, which brings you to the firewall settings blade in the portal. So in Azure, again, this is nice because it can all be sort of a seamless experience where we say, hey, here is your firewall settings configuration blade. And if you actually want to remove one of these that's not necessary, you can do that directly from within the experience. And in fact, we found here that one of these elements is, one of these settings provides pretty wide access to my database. That's this first one that basically allows any Azure IPs to connect. And if I actually turn it off, then that will remove that entry. And I've just, again, locked down my security just a bit more. And I've done all this directly from within the experience. One more example for a really easy thing that we can fix here is the next item, which talks about enabling SQL threat detection. So Federico actually mentioned SQL threat detection to you as one of the major protection elements that a SQL platform offers for GDPR or just generally security purposes. And this is our feature which basically monitors your database at all times and tries to detect any anomalous or suspicious behavior and immediately sends you an alert if anything anomalous was detected. So we're looking for things like potential SQL injection attacks or potential brute force attempts on your database, anything that could possibly indicate a threat or a breach. And so, of course, in order to improve your security, you'll want to enable SQL threat detection, and that's what we are recommending here. And in this case, for my database, SQL threat detection is not enabled. So again, the remediation here is to enable it. Again, I have this very seamless sort of click-through experience where I can come over here to my auditing and threat detection configuration blade within the portal, just turn on threat detection, save it, and again, just lock down an additional item of security on my database. So now that we've basically seen a little bit of what the vulnerability assessment can do, what I'm going to do now is run an additional scan. So basically, what this assessment is doing is running a vulnerability scan in the back end on your database and checking for all these things, right? Looking for all of these relevant security configurations and security settings. And the scan itself is very lightweight. It takes only a few seconds to run. As you can see, it's already completed. And it does not make any changes on your database. So it's entirely read-only. Basically, it can do no harm on your database, which is great. And then that basically shows us an updated view from, we've resolved a few things, we set a baseline, and now we see that our assessment looks a little bit better. By the way, I wanted to show you also that if you're interested in knowing all of the things that we're checking and not only the failing items, then you also have this past tab where you can scroll through and see the full set of vulnerability checks that we are making on the database. And again, for each one of these, we'll describe, if you kind of click through, we'll describe exactly the details of what we're checking. We'll give you the query. So you really have full transparency into exactly what this assessment is checking for. Just a couple more things about the vulnerability assessment. You can actually set this up to run automatically, periodically. Under settings, we have a periodic recurring scan settings. And if you just turn that on, then this will run on a regular basis. You can also see a history of the scans that have run in the past in case you need that for compliance purposes to show kind of the history of scans that have been run. And you can also actually export this report. So if I click on export here, this will actually create and download an Excel file for me, which I can then open, and I can basically see in an Excel file a similar kind of view, which I can then send to whomever I send for compliance purposes. And again, this report has all the information that you saw in the assessment. This is sort of the main view with the passing and failing checks and the details of the failing checks. But you also have a results tab here, which gives you all the details of each of the checks that were run and exactly what the results were. So we really think that this is kind of a major feature that can really help with issues like helping secure data and helping with compliance. And although what we're seeing here is for Azure SQL Database in the Azure portal, the vulnerability assessment is actually also available for your on-premise SQL Server. And you can run that by downloading the latest version of SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS. And this will actually be built in there. And you can actually run that on even down-level SQL Server versions. Folks that have SQL Server 2012 or up can actually run this assessment and see a very similar view on their on-premise SQL Server. So what this leads us into is basically one of the items that we're seeing here in our assessment is one particular item that talks about sensitive data columns being classified. And this is exactly the item that's basically saying, hey, we've identified as part of the scan in your database some potentially sensitive data objects or data columns that may be relevant for whether it's GDPR or whether just needing to be protected because this is sensitive data. And we're showing you these sensitive data columns that we found, and we're advising or recommending that you apply classification to them. And this brings us into the other kind of major investment that we've made, and that's our data discovery and classification. So you see here that I have this list of potentially sensitive data that the system has found for me, columns with names like username, address, city, email, and so on. And again, the recommended action here is to go and classify these, so apply classification to these. So what we're going to do is click here to do the remediation, and this brings us directly into our new data discovery and classification capability. So what we're seeing here is basically an overview of what is the current classification state or sensitive data state of my database. So what we've done here is basically enabled you to apply sensitivity labels to particular columns of data in your database, and then give you a view or a report on what types of sensitive data you have. So we see here basically a graph that shows that we have 12 classified columns that we've applied a classification label to. This is the breakdown of the classification status that they have. So some columns are highly confidential, some are confidential, and some are confidential and relevant for GDPR. And we also understand that we have basically 5 tables out of the 15 here in this database that contain that sensitive data. And we also break it down for you in terms of what we call information types. So these are basically the types of sensitive data that we've discovered, so, or that in this case that you've actually labeled. So for example, we have sensitive data that falls under the information type of credentials, of contact information, credit card, and so on. This is our overview report, and below we see the breakdown of exactly which columns are currently labeled and classified within our database. Now you'll note that this classification label is something that's basically persisted as metadata to the database column itself. And so that means that from now on, we'll be able to actually track what happens with that sensitive data, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment. But in addition, we also see that we have recommendations here, and this is basically what we saw also from the vulnerability assessment check that brought us here. So we have 12 additional columns that we found that we actually recommend that you classify. And if we click here, then I see that there are some details for particular columns that the system identified that we think may be relevant for protection under GDPR. And so, or in this case GDPR, and some are not GDPR related, right? Some are just sensitive data. And we've actually automatically discovered these, automatically classified them according to a certain information type and sensitivity label, which you can then go and modify if you'd like to, but this is our automatic classification. And if I actually want to label these as classified in my database, then all I need to do is click on them. For example, I'll click on address and city, first name, last name, email address, phone number. These all sound like they, in fact, are GDPR relevant data. I can just accept these recommendations, and then that means they are now also tagged or labeled as classified within my database. So I see all of these here. These are the new ones that I've just added. And again, I can modify these at will. So if I think that email address is not contact info, but rather something else, then I can set that. And the same for the sensitivity label. And so now if I save this, then again, that means that my current report on classified data in this database has been updated based on what I just added. And by the way, you don't need to only look at our recommendations. You can actually manually add a classification as well. So if you know that you have a particular column in the customer table, I know that I have a column that's called, let's say, password salt, and I know that that's sensitive data, then I can also add that. I determine the information type, I determine the sensitivity label, and then I can just add that on my own. Again, here we just save this information, and if, as you'll see, everything is just kind of happening here in real time, and if we go back to the overview, then we see now an updated view of what type of sensitive data we have here, right? So now I have 19 classified columns, and they're broken down a little bit differently, and the breakdown of information types is a little different, and I have this report in front of me, which again I can also export similarly to what we saw in vulnerability assessment. I can export this and have a report that I can then share on the sensitivity status of my database. So this is great. We have this report. We know where our sensitive data is. This is, as Federico talked about earlier, this is a critical component of that discover phase in reaching GDPR compliance. But what we can do here is even beyond that. We can actually help track and protect this data. So what we've done is actually built a mechanism that once you've persistently labeled your sensitive columns with these sensitivity labels, then anytime that particular column of data is accessed via any query, we can actually track that piece of sensitive data has been accessed, and you can track that using your SQL auditing. So what I wanted to show you actually here is a new feature that we have within our auditing where, and I'll demonstrate exactly how that works, where we're actually tracking the use of that sensitive data. So as you recall, we just added sensitivity labels for address, line 1, and city in this particular table. And now I'm going to actually run queries and access that data. So this is all kind of live. I'm showing you that I'm connected here to my database, and I'm actually running these live queries. And as soon as I've done that, I can now take a look at my audit log. And we're now going to query the audit log and see that I'm actually looking for access to sensitive data that's occurred in my database within the audit log. So if I actually take a look at the last 2 minutes of audit log data, which only accessed sensitive information, okay, because I have this new tag in my audit log that looks at sensitive information. And if I actually run this now, then I'm now going to look, scanning my audit log for everything that happened in the last 2 minutes that scanned or that accessed sensitive data. And again, all happening in real time here. As you can see, we found 3 entries here, so that's those three queries. And I'm going to cycle through the audit log, the entries here quickly. I see the statements that were run. Here are the statements accessing address and city. And then if I go all the way to the end here, I actually see that there is a new element of the audit entry that's called data sensitivity information. Okay, so I now have basically a report within my audit log saying that data that I have classified as confidential GDPR has just been accessed in my database. And this can be really, really useful for meeting those requirements of basically knowing where your sensitive data is and then tracking its usage. And again, this is one of the main sort of innovations that we've been investing in to help our customers in addressing these kinds of issues, addressing data privacy, addressing GDPR, and also overall improving the security of your database systems. One last thing, I wanted to mention that this data classification capability is actually also available in limited form also for on-premise SQL servers, again via SQL Server Management Studio. Go ahead and download the latest version of SSMS, and you can run this on an on-premise SQL server too to some limited extent. So I'm going to hand it back to Frederica. I hope you found this useful, and I invite you to investigate these new capabilities in more detail.
Thank you very much, Ronit. Great demos. This was to show you that we continue to invest in our data platform to help you have the best in terms of technologies that will help you implement your data security and privacy policies. And in the case of GDPR, that you're able to identify, manage, protect, and report back sensitive data. We did show some of the hero features and services and some of the innovations that we have in our portfolio, but there's a lot more features that can help you with this exercise. Now, of course, independently of the technology that you're using, if you are looking to modernize your data platform, you have a number of potential destinations to take this legacy platform that you're using today. Our portfolio today allows you to have the flexibility of choice to decide if you want to modernize that state entirely on premises, in a private cloud, or in our public cloud, Microsoft Azure and a VM, or in a fully managed environment with our platform as a service solutions. And what are the key solutions that we have in our portfolio? The first one is, of course, SQL Server. And one important thing to mention is that for those of you that run SQL Server in your enterprises and that are still running versions below 2008, you are already without extended support, or you will be real soon without extended support from Microsoft. That means that you will not be receiving any more security updates and patches, which may make it more challenging for you to comply with GDPR. So super important to think about it. If you're running SQL Server, or if you're running any other relational database and you want to upgrade that data state to have the best in terms of a platform that is robust and integrated and that brings all of these great things that we talked about, SQL Server 2017 might be the best solution for you. This is the leading industry platform for the last 3 years, being recognized by Gartner as the leading platform in the relational database market. Also available for Linux and containers in this new version, being recognized as the leader in different industry benchmarks that are not only exclusive to relational databases, but also for more complex workloads like data warehousing and analytics, and is indeed according to the National Institute of Security and Technology here in the United States, NSIT, being recognized over the past 8 years as the least vulnerable or the most secure data platform of the market. As we discussed, complying with GDPR is a comprehensive program, and you might need other technologies to allow you to reason over that sensitive data, to analyze that sensitive data. And SQL Server brings analytics features built into the platform. This is the only commercial database to bring AI built in, and also brings the possibility of implementing an end-to-end mobile BI on any device, iOS, Android, Windows, of course, and browser with HTML5. One important thing to mention here is that this is a hybrid platform. We've been talking a lot about Microsoft being a cloud-first company, and we've been releasing a number of innovations in our cloud first, but our cloud also allows you to, like I mentioned, with our fully managed solutions, eliminate the burden of patching, updating, managing these entire state. And we, with SQL Server being hybrid, allow you to leverage the great things that the cloud has to offer without necessarily having to move your entire state to the cloud. This is a platform that brings in memory for all of the workloads, for writing and querying, and of course consuming information that can allow you to have the best in terms of performance. Another option is Azure SQL Database. This is our fully managed database in the cloud. This is our fully managed SQL Server, and now with the announcement of managed instance, you have the same SQL Server that you know. Starting from SQL Server 2008, you can do a pure lift and shift of your data state to Azure SQL Database Managed Instance without any application code changes. And leveraging the new Azure Database Migration Service, you can streamline these migrations with near zero downtime in your application. Azure SQL Database is a fully intelligent managed solution because it brings a number of services that are built into the platform, like auto-tuning and some of these things that Ronit showed us that can help you have your database on autopilot, let's say, so you can have this intelligent platform that will allow you to continue to monitor the vulnerabilities and the potential breaches in the environment, helping you have a platform that is continuously secure and protected. Another option is, of course, our modern data warehouse in the cloud, Azure SQL Data Warehouse. That is today the solution that brings massive parallel processing. So if you're looking to consolidate your databases, if you're looking for an option to do more with less, and maybe even do this consolidated analytics, this might be the solution for you. Before we open for questions, I'd like to invite you to take the GDPR self-assessment that we created so you can understand the areas of opportunity to improve your state, to guarantee that you have the right set of technologies that will allow you to do the discovery exercise and identify where sensitive data resides, to be able to understand how it's being used and accessed, to understand if you're protecting it enough, and of course, to understand if you have the right tools to report back. This is an online assessment that you can take whenever you want. And we also invite you to take a look at our Microsoft SQL-based technologies ebook. This ebook describes in detail some of the things that we discussed today. We also have shared with you some additional resources that provide you with technical documentation on these new features and services that we demoed today and that we presented in the slides. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, Ronit, for demoing these great innovations of our portfolio. We have around 10 minutes, and I believe that now we can open for questions. Nick?
All right, Federico.
Yes. Can we
yeah.
open for questions? Yes?
Yeah. Thanks so much for that great presentation. It looks like like you said, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I see we've got quite a bit of questions come through. So Federico, if you'd like
Fred,
to
I can ask.
it.
It's Barry here, Fred. I can ask some questions, Nick. Just looking through the questions I've been answering, I've been handling through the different parts. A question for Ronit, hopefully she's still able to talk, is there an overhead if I run either of these? What is the overhead, or how is it handled in terms of the database performance?
Yeah, so if we're talking specifically about both vulnerability assessment and data classification, vulnerability assessment, as I mentioned, runs a scan. The scan is very lightweight. It's not actually part of the main kind of processing part of the database, which means that it really has zero or very, very near zero performance impact, which is great. You can then kind of have that, schedule that to run periodically, and it'll just be a short scan that really does not impact performance that can run periodically. Data classification similarly, right? So it's also basically scanning the data for the recommendations. Besides that, there is no performance implication. The calculation that we do to understand that you've actually accessed sensitive data is done as part of the data processing itself, in line within the SQL engine, and there is really no performance impact to that. I hope that answers.
And can the runs be automatically set up to run at particular times, and then the results saved off, a version of the output report?
Yeah, so right now, this is a new feature. I think you may have seen that it's actually in preview still. So currently we have the automated scheduling set up for just one kind of fixed schedule to run once a week. But eventually we will give more flexibility there to be able to run it whenever and however often is suitable for you. And also, as soon as an automated scan has completed, it actually sends you an email notification that the scan is completed with a kind of summary of the results from that scan.
Okay, that's great. That answers a few questions, actually. There was also a question around the advanced threat protection, around which versions of SQL is it available for?
So if we're asking about the threat detection, detecting anomalous activities, and I assume that that's what the question refers to, then
yes,
SQL threat detection is currently available. Okay, it's currently available for Azure SQL Database, also for Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and it will also be available in the new managed instance, or is already available in the new managed instance offering. It is not available at this time yet for SQL Server on premises. But that's on the overall roadmap. As Federico mentioned, we're developing things cloud first, and it will make it into the server eventually as well.
Okay, there's a question around the data discovery that looks at columns. Does it also release a tool that looks at the data within the column, stored within the columns, or is it just on the column header and tagging?
Yeah, so the data discovery element of the classification is currently, in fact, looking only at metadata. So it can be column names or table names and things like that. And we're currently basically running an algorithm based on those. That can be expanded. Again, this is also a new feature, and we're looking into kind of more and deeper ways to try to identify where sensitive data could be.
Sure. And then another question relates to vulnerability assessments. So can I set a policy so basically where I name users that can be part of the monitoring policy? For example, looking for privileged users and then forming a policy to monitor their activity on tables containing GDPR data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I saw that question. I think that's a great question and a great idea. So thank you to the audience for that idea. We are looking at creating kind of policies, high-level policies that can then be applied based on certain levels of classification or based on results of vulnerabilities or certain elements of the assessment found. We don't have anything automatic like that yet, but that sounds like a great scenario and something that we will be looking into.
Okay, I think we've covered most of the questions which have come up. If anybody else has a question which they want to repose, which they feel hasn't been answered, or a new question, if they want to drop it in, we'll answer that now. Oh, there's a question here which is, after the data classification exercise is done, is there a way to remediate? For example, a table is discovered to be highly confidential. Can that table be encrypted? I'm guessing that just the standard SQL capabilities can be used for that. Ronit?
Yeah, no, that's also a great question, and you're right, Barry. On the one hand, whoever's using the system can go do it on their own and then say, hey, I've now identified that this is sensitive, so I'll go encrypt it. But we're we're actually trying to provide, again, a more seamless experience for customers to do that. So similarly to what I showed you with a vulnerability that was found and then to kind of lead you to what you need to do to resolve it. So we're also planning and looking into providing kind of something that leads you and shows you what kind of encryption options are available, and then you can go and encrypt based on that. And as we think about this going forward, kind of share with everyone the thoughts that we're thinking about taking this kind of looking into the future is to really be able to then define policies that say, hey, if you know, any data that has a certain type of classification, I want it to automatically have a certain encryption feature applied or something along those lines. And so those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. In the meantime, we'll try to give you as much kind of guidance as we can to protect the data and take that next step.
And then another question actually relates to, for those on the call who may not be aware, we have currently in preview 2 offerings for platform as a service solution for Postgres and MySQL, which will be coming to market shortly. And the question relates to, are any plans to bring the vulnerability assessment functionality to those platform as a service solutions when they go GA?
So yeah, the answer is yes, absolutely. We're absolutely looking to have all our security capabilities be as consistent as possible across the different offerings that we have. And certainly in looking, you know, we have a lot to do here and a lot of different things we'd like to support, but we're certainly looking at also providing similar assessment for our PostgreSQL and MySQL offerings, absolutely.
There's a question around, is vulnerability assessment available in SQL Server Management Studio version 17.4 or later? I guess that's a question. It's the current version of SQL Server Management Studio?
Yeah, so the latest version released, I believe we're now on 17.6, which was just released, I think, a couple of days ago. Vulnerability assessment was initially released in 17.4. And if you take a look at some of the resources we sent out, hopefully, then you'll see the documentation on the vulnerability assessment for within SSMS or for SQL Server, and you'll see that it is supported from 17.4 and up. The data classification capability that we now also have kind of exposed in SSMS is available from 17.5. So you'll need SSMS 17.5 for that.
And then there's another question, is there any plans to release vulnerability assessment for Azure Analysis Services? Again, the platform as a service solution, which I know is growing extremely quickly and being adopted by customers in the field very fast.
Well, you know, again, we're looking to do as much as we can across the board. And again, great input from the audience. We'll definitely look into that as well and see how we can provide some value for analysis services as well. Sure.
There's a number of questions around copies of today's webinar. Maybe somebody can answer that. I'm guessing it's going to be online and available for review or for replay at any point in time.
Absolutely, yes. So everybody's going to receive the recording after this webinar.
Yep. Okay, I think we're at the top of the hour, Fred.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much, Barry, for helping with the Q&A. Ronit for demoing these great innovations, the data discovery and classification, and the vulnerability assessment. And thank you all for the time. With that, I pass the word to Nick. Thank you, Nick.
All right, thanks everyone for joining today. As Federico said, you should be receiving an MP4 of this session within 48 hours. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.